Nigeria hydrocarbon sector remains the cornerstone of Nigeria's economy, driving both economic growth and serving as the main source of hard currency. However, the country's heavy reliance on oil also exacerbates its vulnerability. Nigeria is grappled with poor governance, weak institutions, deteriorating security conditions, spiraling economic decline, and uninspired leadership. My name is Mvemba Pezo Dizolele. I'm the Director and Senior Fellow of the Africa Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, we are delighted and honored to share with you the results of a long-standing report that my colleague Cameron Hudson, who's a Senior Fellow here for the Africa Program, authored and published recently. This is a report that came about after substantial research on the ground in Abuja, in Lagos, and in Port Harcourt. Accordingly, we've assembled an esteemed panel today, which consists of Fadekemi Abiru, who's heads of Insight at Steers Inc. in Lagos, Amaka Anku, who's Africa Director and Head of Practice at Eurasia Group, which is based here in Washington, D.C. Retired General Brigadier Saleh Bala, who's CEO, Chief Executive Officer of White Inc. in Abuja. Without further ado, I would like to welcome everyone today, the panelists, but also our audience, and turn the time to Cameron Hudson to share with us his findings before we delve into our discussion. Cameron, welcome.
Thank you, Vemba. It's great to be here. I'll try to summarize the report that's available on the website now in the next 5 minutes or so. The paper that we researched, I have to acknowledge that Vemba was with me on the ground in Nigeria those many weeks doing this research, was done last year in the first few months of the Tinubu government, and starts by looking at President Tinubu's leadership style and early decisions to assess where we think he might take some of the big institutional and structural challenges Nigeria's economy and political system face. Just to recall, President Tinubu came into office with a weaker than normal mandate, we assess, with court challenges hanging over his victory, as well as the reputational harm that comes from being the first Nigerian president elected without receiving a majority of the popular vote. Described by many as a consensus builder and a deal maker, he ran on his reputation as a results-oriented administrator. And I assess that this focus is likely to be much more on outcomes than on process, highlighting several key examples from his first months in power. First, his cabinet choices have disappointed many who had hoped to see the kind of young, dynamic, technocratic government officials he reportedly assembled during his time as Lagos State Governor. Instead, his record number of ministerial appointments has created a view that politics will trump policy. Second, Tinubu's decision to keep the position of petroleum minister for himself, as previous Nigerian presidents have done, seems to have been a missed opportunity to break from tradition and signal that a reform of Nigeria's oil sector might be coming. Third, hasty announcements of reforms to remove a national fuel subsidy and float the foreign exchange rate appear to have been done with little consultation with economic advisors and without any of the kind of short or long-term strategies to mitigate the unintended consequences of his decisions. And then finally, Tinubu's robust defense of regional democracy in the face of Niger's military coup and threats to employ Nigeria's thinly stretched military to mount an invasion of Niger to restore to power its detained president presented Tinubu as an impetuous and uncalculating leader and created early tensions with his own military. We then turn to look at the oil sector largely as the overall driver of growth and make some assessments there of where we might see things going given a range of external factors. So first, what we heard was that many argue the oil industry itself is too big to disrupt and has too many entrenched interests embedded throughout for one person to reform, even if that person is the president. Few of the people that we spoke to across industry and policy sectors believe that existing legislation, the Petroleum Industry Act, or PIA, conceived of more than 20 years ago and passed in 2021, has arrived in time to either reverse the steady decline of the oil sector or signal to outside investors that Nigerian leaders are in fact interested in transforming the sector. The message we heard repeatedly was that while Nigerian lawmakers were busy spending 2 decades debating how to transform and govern the sector and the world changed around it. Today, oil discoveries have been made all across the West African coast and further across Africa. IOCs now have a wealth of international investment opportunities from which to choose. The fundamental weakness in current onshore oil infrastructure has been exacerbated by fraught community relations as more and more responsibility for local development and service delivery has been foisted onto international oil companies, creating a vicious cycle whereby oil infrastructure is either vandalized or now breaks down, creating environmental damage and exacerbating grievances with local communities, prompting lawsuits, many times in foreign judicial districts. Nigeria's military, which is responsible for the country's internal security, is now deployed on security operations in 34 of the country's states. But what we have seen is that the more money and more forces deployed specifically to the Delta, the worse the security situation has become in recent years. Though assessments vary, some argue that at least 1/4 and as much as 1/2 of Nigeria's daily oil output is being stolen by militant groups across the 6 states of the Niger Delta. Lastly, regarding the idea of creating a new reality around gas or renewables, despite modest enthusiasm, which we, I think, assess bordered on lip service from many government officials, it seems clear that a transition to a more gas-based system would mean undoing an entrenched and in many ways perverse incentive structure from the top down that politicians, to us at least, neither demonstrated the courage nor willingness to take on, at least in the near term. Beyond that, it would also mean changing the popular conception that the country is an oil economy, although President Tinubu's recent appointment of a minister of gas was seen by some as a potentially hopeful sign of changes to come. Aside from a handful of civil society organizations and Delta-based NGOs, there has been no real strong indigenous advocacy movement that we saw from key actors in Nigeria pressing for a transition to clean energy or a move away from oil production. So looking ahead at the trend we now see of international firms leaving Nigeria as a whole, but in particular leaving the onshore oil sector, most of the major oil industry stakeholders we spoke to all appear sharply divided about what the net effect would be of having indigenous oil companies assume the assets and production capacity of international operators. Some argued to us that the departure of large IOCs presents a historic opportunity to develop and nurture local talent, keep Nigeria's oil wealth in Nigeria where it can benefit the people and the economy, and become more responsive to the needs and demands of the communities where that oil is being extracted. But others argued that local operators will be seen as having fewer resources to pay militants or corrupt politicians, as unwilling to buy off local communities with gifts or development projects to create goodwill or to compensate for environmental damage, and that they would have they would be less of a security target for militant groups. Being Nigerian, these operators are also seen to be less susceptible to the kinds of shareholder pressure and bad press that impacts IOCs located in Houston, London, or The Hague. So against this backdrop, oil majors and the middle class are not the only ones seeking an exit from Nigeria's economy. Large providers of consumer goods, such as ShopRite or others such as Procter & Gamble and Unilever, have also decided recently to end efforts to manufacture locally. This raises larger questions going beyond Nigeria's oil sector about the ability to do business in the country today, irrespective of national origin. To conclude, I think that like so many discussions that we have all had about Nigeria, there are vastly different perspectives on how to interpret all of these trends and data. You can tell a compelling story about a Nigeria battered by corruption and leadership deficiencies that functions despite of itself, or you can see a vibrant and resilient system that has perennially underperformed, but that remains on the precipice of a takeoff with the proper leadership. Ultimately, this paper does not take a definitive position on that outcome, and so I will leave it to this esteemed panel today to draw some of those conclusions. So thank you very much, and back to you, Vemba.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Pretty expensive summary there. So I'll turn without further ado to our esteemed panel to react. Fadekemi, we start with you. This is what you do day in, day out. Where is our esteemed country of Nigeria standing within this space? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mbemba. And also thank you, Cameron, for that insightful summary. Good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Fadekemi Abiru. I'm the head of insights at Steers. And at Steers, what we essentially do is produce data and intelligence for decision makers and professionals who are investing in the African continent. It's a privilege to join today's panel and also just discuss, I guess, the vital and also challenging dynamics of Nigeria's economy and also the oil sector in particular. I think when like a useful place for me to start is just like reflecting on President Tinubu's like past or first year as president. I do believe that we face a pivotal moment in Nigeria's economy. One place to just kind of like start or just unpack this from when we're even thinking about the performance of the oil sector is looking back to the pandemic, because that's one of the places, or that's kind of like a pivotal moment for that particular sector, in the sense that when we look at oil production, we see that our oil production levels have not actually recovered since then. So at the onset of 2020, oil production stood at about 1.8 million barrels per day. And then 3 months later, we witnessed a significant decline that was exacerbated both by vandalism, I think Cameron already touched on that, but also the global downturn in oil demand due to the pandemic. By early this year, we've already started seeing that our production has started to stabilize around 1.43 million barrels per day. It's still a far cry from our peak of 2.5 million barrels back in 2005, and also below our potential given our proven reserves. So just thinking about this period of transition, I think something that's noteworthy to kind of bring out is the fact that President Tinubu had retained the role of petroleum minister. I think Cameron touched on that as well. And that's a decision that echoes the practices of his predecessors, but it's also one that centralizes critical decision-making. Under his leadership, we have seen the oil sector GDP growth rebound to 5.1% in the first quarter of 2024. That's up from negative 4.2% in the corresponding period last year. But it's important to couch this improvement within the context of, a sector that's still recovering from prolonged underinvestment and operational challenges. So our general view essentially is that, President Tinubu came into power at a time, I guess, at a time when Nigeria's economy had faced about 8 years of like a struggle, like policy missteps, and that has also been evidenced in some of the key indicators. So whether you're looking at, high and rising inflation, so headline inflation currently sitting at 33.69%, but also low and stagnating growth, which is, not characteristic of an economy that's supposed to be developing at the moment. So when we think about our outlook, it's one where there's a lot of emphasis essentially to expect like more strategic policy direction, whether it's in the areas of macroeconomy, so in terms of managing inflation, also managing our FX performance, and then finally also looking at critical sectors that used to be cornerstones or benchmarks of the economy and thinking about ways to move that forward. So I look forward to discussing that in more detail.
Thank you very much, Fadekemi, from that perspective from the ground. Amaka Anku, we'll go to you. I know I switched the order a little bit because I want to get the perspective straight from Nigeria. From where you stand as an advisory group, you engage with a set of stakeholders and interested groups that want to engage with Nigeria. How do you see this outlook?
Okay, so thank you very much for having me, Vemba, and thanks to Cameron and Fadekemi for framing remarks. Yeah, I mean, look, I think if we are, thinking about broadly, where does Nigeria stand? What still needs to be done? It's very important for me. I just like to start with the context. Nigeria for decades. This is not a new thing. Nigeria for decades has an unproductive economy. right? We don't produce that much. Nigeria as a country doesn't produce that much, doesn't have any other major exports except for oil. So you have this, because the result of having an unproductive economy is this strange imbalance where you have a sector that is 6% of GDP. The oil and gas sector is 6% of GDP. That means that Nigerians are earning income as a country from 94%. 94% of the income is not from oil. 6% of GDP, 40% of federal government revenue now. It used to be 70, 60%. It's low. All right, giving you over 90% of your exports. Okay, this is the fundamental problem, and this is when everything else flows from this. And to be fair, I mean, I think because I think a lot of people, Cameron was talking about people stopping thinking about Nigeria as an oil economy. Oil hasn't driven growth in Nigeria for decades. Oil has not been a driver of growth. Oil sector has not been a driver of growth. It's been contracting for decades. The ICT sector has been driving growth, financial services, insurance. So I think just starting there, and the reason I start there is because when we talk about what Tinubu faced when he started, it's easy for people, a lot of us outside government, to say, well, these reforms were taken without proper planning. There's no amount of planning, in my view, there's no amount of planning that you could have done in 2 years, in one term, that would make it less painful. Why? Because the fundamental problem, this is an economy that collects less than 10% of revenue, 10% of its GDP in revenue. The only other countries in the world that are comparable to this are failed states: Afghanistan, Somalia, right? So the reason I say that is, like, there's no money to make productive investments. There's no money to do the things that would actually cushion some difficult reforms, like, mass transportation, rail, transit, the kinds of things that if you had that, okay, it wouldn't be so bad that petroleum is so expensive. Because in a way, it's a vicious cycle. And this is one of the things that I'm talking about with my clients a lot, right? So we, people say subsidies needed to go because you need to free up. Nigeria was spending like $10 billion on subsidies in a country that has a budget of like 25 billion, right? US dollars equivalent. So subsidies needed to go to free up funding to make productive investments. But at the same time, if you take away subsidy, it's driving inflation. There's all these other inflation. So there's a vicious cycle, right? But it's one that ultimately you still have to get back to. You can't do anything else if you don't have money. And so I keep going back to why, I like to talk about this revenue crisis a lot. And I think that should be the focus of any reform efforts. Like, you can't make productive investments real, the things that make an economy productive, without funding. And there are only two ways of government funding. It's either you're raising revenue or you're borrowing. If you're not raising revenue, then you have to borrow. There's no two ways around it. So people complain, oh, Nigeria is borrowing too much. But a part of the reason we got where we are today in Nigeria is because of the implicit consensus on that military rule, which is elite consensus was, you don't tax us and you can do whatever you want. Don't tax us, you can do whatever you want, right? And vice versa. We won't tax you and you won't hold us accountable. And voila, that's how we need to now shift away from that. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think, where are we today? I do think that the big difference between 5 years ago, say the previous administration and this administration, has been that we have clear direction from monetary authorities. I would say the biggest achievement so far in the 1 year has been central bank reform. We have predictability. There's a clear direction on where the central bank is headed. They want to raise rates. They want to rein in inflation. There's a clear direction on, once we start seeing inflation coming down, we will start holding rates, we'll start bringing rates back. There's transparency, there's predictability. What's missing, in my view, is a similar clear direction from fiscal authorities. And I don't mean finance ministry. I mean fiscal authorities, the federal government as a whole. Central bank, clear difference, night and day. Rest of the federal government, really much the same, murky, right? We need clear direction from the fiscal authorities on what is the growth strategy, what is the strategy to boost non-oil exports, because that's how you're going to grow, right? And clear coordination around that strategy. And I think very importantly, communication to Nigerians about what the strategy is and how can an average Nigerian see themselves in it. That's extremely important. I think systematically has been underestimated in Nigeria. The importance of a rallying cry. This is where we want to see Nigeria go to. This is why we need these painful reforms. This is how it's going to help us. And these are these are going to be the benefits. It's not going to take a year. Like, sometimes Tinubu says, oh, well, you're crying now. Don't worry, it's going to be better. It may not be better by the end of your second, your first term, but it needs to be clear why. And that communication needs to be there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Amaka. Great insights there. Brigadier General Bala, security is a problem. It's not abated. It's expanded. What I like about Nigeria always reminds me of Congolese. They're very creative with words. So we've gone from insurgency to banditry. And then in between there, we have bunkering and kidnapping and everything else. How is this affecting us? The geopolitics, the economics of the country, particularly in light of what both Fadekemi and Amaka have described, whether we talk about post-pandemic or what the pandemic, but long before the pandemic, we were facing this. And now, when we look to what Cameron described in the report, there are other horizons out there for oil companies. Even Uganda has oil, Namibia, DRC, and so on. This issue of security is one that needs to be tackled, and the military is stretched thin. How do you read the situation? What needs to be done?
Thank you very much, Mbemba, and my colleagues who have spoken before me and spoken so eloquently and factually. I am very, very happy with the report that has been presented, and I really look forward to reading it further substantially. For any patriot, one will feel itched and challenged by the truism in it all. And it's difficult to accept when the truth is told to you, but I really will commend and congratulate the authors of the report and as it is presented. One simple fact to ask about the securitization of this vital region is, how do you really securitize a situation that has over decades been militarized, like the one of the Niger Delta, which is the major oil producing area of one vital national prime driver of the national resource where it is sourced. My friend Amaka spoke about how there are other sectors of the economy that could actually equal or overcome oil. But oil indeed is one sector where one bulk of a huge resource that drives the economy of Nigeria comes from. And it is the one that is most relied upon. Then back to trying to attempt to address my question. Since the Tinubu government came up, they realized the importance and how vital that section of the country, the region, is. And one could clearly see from the new appointments of service chiefs that have taken over, all through from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and even the police, that there has been an uptick of kinetic solutions to really dealing with the questions of militancy, bunkering, vandalism, and whatever kinds of convenient typology you can ascribe to it. There have been arguments about issues of proportionality in the several bombings of platforms and illegal installations, and even arrest and confiscation of vessels and illegal refineries that we have received since this new government came. There's never been on record, except during the Abacha days, that we have seen concerted military action in the Niger Delta to deal with this problem as is. You know, even while the Niger Delta issue was dealt with, a bigger and a larger Gulf of Guinea irritation. From my assessment, this is where we have seen an uptick of operations by the Navy, the Air Force particularly, and with acquisition of platforms, both maritime and aerial platforms, to really deal with this matter. Again, the issue of environment, where you blow up platforms that have oil, where you blow up installations that produce oil, is another question. And as well, the issue of elitism, which Amaka again touched upon. How much of a pacifist political approach is this government creating in order to deal with the matter of the depth at which the elites in that region are already enmeshed in this problem? There was the big argument over the contract, the huge contract award to Tantita, not weeks after the Tinubu government came into power. Like it or not, propaganda or not, we have seen on papers confirmation that Tantita, a non-state actor sanctioned by state, is actually working with the Navy, with NIMASA, and bringing results of the arrest of vessels with millions of crude oil. And that is helping the industry. The pressure on the militants, we could see, unfortunately, has been resulted in attacks on the military itself, with the unfortunate Okwama crisis, which went between, it is either the military that has been massacred or that community has been massacred. So question is, the big thing is to securitize the exploitation of the oil resources and also protecting critical national infrastructure. When you speak about IOCs departing from Nigeria and going to other fields, do they find the quality of oil there is in Nigeria, the so much celebrated sweet crude, is it found in these other climes for which the refineries across the world find more comfort in producing? Or is it the security challenges? And also, we know the problem of the unease of doing business in Nigeria, you know, because of the involvement of underhand involvement of state actors and unstable laws and regulations and policies, in spite the petroleum industry bill. You know, there are still some old system of doing things by the public servants that it's in itself discouraging the IOCs from staying on in Nigeria. And really, if the IOCs will have better protection, not just for their security, but also for policy policy delivery, will they rather stick to the Nigerian sweet crude than to leave? So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, General Bala. With that, I'll actually start with you. For our audience, the new report that we're discussing is titled Nigeria's Evolving Outlook, New Politics, Old Outcomes, authored by my colleague Cameron Hudson, after research on the ground. General Bala, I will start with you. how has the new administration, a year later, has negotiated this space, this security space?
Give me November.
Yeah, so I was saying, we'll start with you.
Yes.
Given what you just said, it's been a year since President Tinubu has assumed his role as a president. How has he negotiated the security space? In the Delta, we knew when we were there, we learned quite a bit, and it's not an easy situation. Already one concern was that he was, the government, the state was encouraging dealing with the same people who were committing these crimes as then outsourcing security to them in so many ways. That can be problematic. But you are the expert here, security expert. How is the state negotiating that space?
Yeah, it's clear, for the basis of this conversation, we all know, like the report itself has said, that the forces of Nigeria, particularly the military that is burdened with every aspect of security in Nigeria, it is the one tool in the box where every problem is a nail. Actually, the military is overstretched. The land forces, even when a section of it is configured as amphibious forces, is less than 200,000. Under-equipped, under-administered, under-trained for these kinds of operations. So it became only necessary, even before this government, that with negotiation, some of the prime militants, commanders, should be coveted, so to speak, into serving local security. And aside being particularly mischievous about it, it only serves the sense that the community should police itself. But one question is, to which extent does government allow the community to do some acquisitions and configure forces which are equal or even better resourced and equipped than the state forces? This is what we are seeing with Tantita, and even the forces under Asari Dokubo and the other forces. I recall in the early days of the government, Asari Dokubo was, in fact, very proud to announce to Nigeria that he was in charge of the security of 7 states against banditry and kidnapping in northern Nigeria, not just his own area. So this is really the politics that has come into security in Nigeria, for which as I had mentioned, billions of dollars of contract was awarded to Tantita to serve the security of the Niger Delta. But you question, in a situation where from earlier governments, again, particularly during the days of Abacha, in whatever words he was described, where he decided to take a sole decisive military action. Even then, how were they able to perform in this very, very difficult terrain, which required specialized training, specialized equipment, which are well and far beyond the capacity of the Nigerian government to really be able to procure and supply to the forces. But the most important one, just like the one in the Northeast, is how capable to local knowledge do these forces, which are regularly in transition, how well do they know these creeks and terrain, the general terrain, where they're easily ambushed? So this called only to common sense that the best way to go about it is to procure the buy-in of the locals, and you need to identify their leadership. But the political question also is, to what extent do you do that, as against now what the government is doing, where Tantita seems to be the main decisive factor that is unaccountable, that is not accountable to local and international law as it is. This is a big question.
Thank you very much, General.
Yes.
I think you highlight some of the challenge of co-opting those actors into the system. Easily, the government can lose control, but also can encourage other bad actors, quote unquote here, who are not, they call them non-state actors, who are not accountable neither to the communities nor to the people of Nigeria, neither to the civilian leadership to enter that space.
As well as you create spoilers as well.
Exactly, that's what I mean. You end up actually feeding the beast, and that's maybe even a bigger problem. But the reality is exactly what you described there. Amaka, you talked about the friction between fiscal authority and the direction there, or lack thereof, and the central bank. How do we reconcile this, and why is there such a gap between the two?
No, so just to be clear, I didn't say there's a friction. Actually, there's probably better coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities in Nigeria currently than there's been in a while. So when I say, the central bank governor, finance minister, they seem to be quite aligned in terms of where rates are going, what that means. The federal government has been borrowing more short term because they understand rates are higher, and so you don't want to lock yourself into really high interest rates for a long time. So there's coordination. So what I'm saying, I think what I'm saying though is, in some ways, what they've done so far is the easy parts, right? Liberalizing your foreign exchange market, as hard as it's been for Nigerians, because it's been inflationary. There's been a lot of instability. In some ways, it's the easier thing to do, because the hard thing to do is to dramatically raise your non-oil exports. And that's what I'm saying. That's where I'm saying there hasn't been a clear direction yet from the federal government and all the way up to the presidency. So when I say fiscal authorities, I don't mean the finance ministry. I just mean the government as a whole. There hasn't been clear direction on that. And I acknowledge that it's harder to do, right? Removing subsidies. Again, very difficult, painful for Nigerians, but it's the easier thing to do than to say, here's the growth strategy, here's how we're going to drive it. So let me give you an example. And so your question is, why is that? Look, I think one of the reasons is that there isn't enough points of leadership in the government, right? Just having a frank conversation. I don't know who's listening, but there's not enough. There are pockets of really well-respected people, we know Wale Edun, obviously the central bank governor, maybe FIRS, maybe infrastructure minister, but it's not enough, right? Like, you need to, Wale Edun is wearing like multiple hats, too many hats, perhaps, and he's only one person. And I think I think the president needs to put more centers of leadership and competence that are well respected, that can lead on other efforts like driving non-oil sector growth. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So when I was last, I'm in Lagos I'm in Nigeria every quarter. I was talking to some, the heads of the business, small business association in Lagos. And they're telling me, look, that a lot of their members are looking to exporting more, because Nigeria's purchasing capacity is lower. And so if you're making, like, a lot of Nigerian manufacturing is like, pretty low complexity, like bottles and shoes and rubber. Like, so if you're manufacturing bottles and it used to go for 500 naira, whatever, 700 naira, you can still sell it for 500 CFA. Or 700 CFA, and you're going to get way more naira than you were getting before, and it can boost your income. So there's a lot of effort to try and see, to sell Nigerian manufactured goods outside, because Naira is cheap and people are acknowledging it as cheap. The agriculture minister, the finance minister, they've both acknowledged that a lot of Nigerian food production is being exported because it's seen as cheap in the region. So if that is happening organically, what I haven't seen is, okay, here's the government's plan to make it easier for small businesses to sell these to exports, or for food production, to increase food production so that there's more for exports and more for Nigerians. So it's that kind of clear strategic government investment or backing to facilitate the transition that's already happening, because it can be very powerful, right? Like, this is when you're supposed to, the thing that you're supposed to benefit from when your currency is cheap is that you can raise your export. So let's actually produce more to export.
The one question before we go to Fadekemi. I also heard you say that there is not enough revenue. The state is not raising enough revenue. How do we improve that? What's the challenges there? Taxes and others. Nigerians are they're producing, you made it clear, they're producing. Just because the oil sector is faltering, people are producing in other sectors. Is the state able to raise the type of revenue to offset the gap? Amaka, is that to you? Did you hear me? Are you muted?
Is that for me? Sorry, I thought you were talking to
No, it was for you before we move to Fadekemi.
No. I'll keep this very short. No, there's not enough revenue, period. I mean, look at South Africa's budget. How many people are in South Africa? Maybe 50 million? South Africa spends 100 billion or more, 120 billion a year. How much is Nigeria spending? Maybe 30? Vietnam, like all the countries that are comparable to Nigeria in terms of size, in terms of GDP, Vietnam, Philippines, all of them, they're spending way more. So yeah, no, I'll just stop there.
So there's room there for reform. Thank you, Amaka. Fadekemi, you talked about, kind of going back, saying some of these problems obviously predated President Tinubu. We're not blaming him for all the problems of Nigeria. Nigeria has existed long before he took over, and there've been a compounding of challenges and problems. But the point of reference you used was the pandemic and how things had slumped a little bit, and you've seen some improvement. Where are those improvements, and how does Nigeria sustain them, given everything that we've discussed so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question. I mean, I feel like we've all touched on some of those improvements throughout this conversation. There are two in particular that serve as a reference point, or kind of like, I'll call them the landmarks for President Tinubu's administration. The first one is the liberalization of the FX market, and the second one was the announcement of the subsidy removal. So like Amaka mentioned, we've seen that improvement in the management of the FX market. There's that clear policy direction that's coming out of the central bank. And that's very, very important as well, because when you look at how the management of our FX regime in previous years, it was basically marred by a lot of opaqueness, and it really made doing business very difficult. But one of the things that was very clear, at least up until earlier on this year, was this incomplete transition in monetary policy that we have now seen the central bank starting to correct, with more decisive circulars coming out around the regulation of the BDCs, and trying to formalize that structure a bit more so that they reduce speculative activity. And then also outside of that, it's just the past MPC meetings that we've had, we've seen that clear direction from policy, where it's we're in this tightening phase, and hiking rates to kind of send this positive signal to investors. So that's one area that we have seen, like we're seeing some improvement. That predictability is also very important for investors, and just that commitment to see things through. As Amaka mentioned as well, like in other sectors of the economy, right, you are seeing like, and I think Cameron even mentioned this as well, like, you know, with the FMCGs, that response to like the difficult business environment. So it's not just in the oil sector that you're seeing investors fleeing, but also with FMCGs fleeing as well. And it's understandable, right? It's like when you think about like rising inflation and the fact that consumers' wallets have been pinched. But one thing that I think FMCGs are starting to like appreciate is, while the rising inflation has led to this like shrinking of consumer wallets, it's also actually stratified the consumer landscape across Nigeria. So you do have like the upper income earners, and then, you know, you now have this hollowing out of the middle class into the lower income side. So there is that, like, you know, you do need to appreciate that if you're going to, like, you have two different kinds of consumers now to serve. Like if you're an investor or like you're like a company just trying to navigate where to play in Nigeria, or like where the opportunities actually lie. And while what we're seeing with, like, especially on the lower income side, is that one long-term opportunity that can come out there is the fact that, you know, that some kind of improvement in consumer financing. So Nigeria is not a heavy credit culture, not a heavy credit economy. And that's something that makes it very difficult for demand to recover whenever the economy faces like significant shocks like the ones that we have seen recently. So already we're starting to see, like, you know, all sorts of different buy now, pay later solutions coming around, where, you know, there are these companies that, in exchange for like this commitment for consumers to pay pre-agreed installments, they can get like their products up front, you know, and that cuts across whether it's just for individuals, but also for MSMEs as well. So as long as those solutions continue to get some kind of, like, you know, the operating environment is better, it's supportive, those are the kinds of things that can actually continue to even support other sectors of the economy as well. We've also seen that on the tech ecosystem side as well, like, so a lot of these buy now, pay later solutions, they're actually coming from the tech ecosystem, but that's also, you know, that's also an area that has actually proven some resilience. A proxy that we tend to use as a measure for the tech ecosystem is the ICT sector, so like their contribution to GDP. And I think we mentioned earlier how that has become like increasingly over time, like a significant contributor to Nigeria's economy. And this is even in the face of what people would call like a VC funding winter that we're starting to face as you know, central banks across the world have been hiking rates, and that has gone on to increase the cost of financing. But even on the back of that, we are seeing, like, you know, the startups that are trying to set up within this ecosystem, kind of, you know, coming up with more creative solutions, or even in some cases building the infrastructure that is needed to kind of be a lever of opportunity and growth for the rest of the Nigerian economy. Amaka, I think I saw you put your hand up. Was there something you wanted to add?
Well, I really just wanted to say really quickly that I do think that this narrative of like everybody's leaving Nigeria has been a little bit overblown. It's definitely been overblown on social media. I think there's one oil company, Statoil, that left. Shell is leaving its onshore investments because offshore is just a lot more attractive on a fiscal terms. I know people at Shell are pretty enthusiastic about Nigerian investments offshore. So I just think, and even like with the FMCG, I just think that we should be careful. Like, I think that it's been very overblown that everybody's leaving. Unilever stopped manufacturing, P&G stopped manufacturing, but P&G had a very, very small market share in the sector that it was at the point that it stopped manufacturing. So just caution there.
Thank you very much. General Bala, did I see your hand as well, or was that inadvertent?
If quickly, you know, just for the opportunity of the conversation, you know, I listened when it is said that the intervention in the foreign exchange market is an achievement. But my question is, what really controls supply, it is demand. And as long as we are of very, very low industrial capacity, and also we have an elite that has this huge taste for foreign everything, and as well as essentially importing of every aspect of production and consumption remains import-based. There's just so much we can do about issuing new regulations every day, which even go back to contradict what we had issued yesterday. I mean, right from the former administration of leadership of the CBN, we have seen how policies, regulations are issued by the week, which further contradicts, the foreign exchange circumstance that we have. It is easy to blame the BDCs and the innocent malams who lie in the streets to send their dollars, to sell their dollars. In my simple infantry mind argument, I told people when by some kind of gerrymandering, the dollar was brought down from 1,900 to 1,000. I told them, I said, gentlemen, just wait for these two things to happen: the annual Hajj and school fees. And then we will really know if the central bank actually knows what it is doing. There is really nothing we can do about Forex. We are not selling oil. None of our industries is doing any production to any capacity that will yield foreign exchange. We are not exporting even our real agricultural produce, which sector is even bigger than oil. We are not doing it in a very transparent, government-controlled way that will yield foreign exchange for us to stabilize the naira. We are all doing the politics of chasing BDCs. BDCs only sell; they don't speculate. They respond to the forces of demand. I just thought I should flag that.
Thank you very much, General. We didn't actually get any question from the audience. So there's one question I think we will put to all of you panelists, and then we'll get Cameron to offer his remarks before we close the event, unless a question pops up from the audience. The question is really, what recommendations do you have as panelists going forward for Nigeria? Nigeria is important. Every Nigeria likes to remind the world this. Nigeria is very important. And Nigeria is facing some challenges, but there are no challenges that I suppose Nigerians cannot tackle. We've just not gotten there yet. So what recommendations do you have at this point moving forward for this important oil-producing country? We'll start with you, Amaka.
Okay. Raise revenue. Communicate clearly and compellingly why you have to raise it and what you're using the money for. Honestly, I think it's extremely important. I think that one of the things that governments underestimate in Nigeria is how important it is to involve your intellectual elite. Figure out a way to get more Nigerian intellectuals who understand the core issues, the structural issues. Get them out there on TV talking about the structural issues. People need to understand that this is difficult. Like, I'm not, we're saying it, we're talking here. This is difficult to do. It's difficult to turn an economy that has been unproductive for decades around. It's not going to happen in a year or in two. So raise revenue, explain it compellingly, get more of your intellectuals to break down the structural issues so people understand what the general was talking about. Ultimately, the way to build confidence in the economy and in your currency, which is what the general was talking about. Like, people are going to keep dollarizing if they don't trust the direction, is to truly sell a clear direction on how you're going to raise non-oil exports and get people to believe it.
Thank you very much, Amaka. Fadekemi, your recommendations for Nigeria?
Yeah, I think mine would be, it's easy to go for the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, but it's actually more important to be more strategic and make sure that you have a follow-up plan, right? Because that is one of the things that would make policy consistency easier for the government to do. Obviously, there like all sorts of unpredictabilities, black swans can occur. So it's very, very difficult to preempt or to know, like, you know, a pandemic could happen, something else could happen. But it's very important for the government at the point of formulating policy and also setting out to implement it or make any announcements to be as forward-looking as possible. And that involves, you know, actual like consultations with the public, communication with the public, thinking through like all the different unintended consequences that could come about as a result of a policy, and making sure that there are safeguards in place to see this through. I mean, an example of this is a subsidy. I mean, a lot of us keep referring to the fact that the subsidy is gone or the subsidy has been removed. But if you're actually comparing the landing cost of petrol to the pump price of petrol at different states in Nigeria, it's very, very clear that to some extent the subsidy still remains, right? And so, you know, that kind of confusion in the policy landscape is something that the country needs to do away with, and what I would definitely recommend that policymakers need to pay attention to moving forward.
Thank you very much, Fadekemi. General Bala, 1 minute.
1 minute. Thank you very much. You know, coming from a sector where I remain perpetually a public servant, even in retirement. But sometimes, you know, for real, I'm a Nigerian. I love my country. I'm a patriot. I'm a senior citizen at 65. And I think I should speak boldly. Amaka spoke about intellectualism in governance. It's very, very important, because we have seen a culture where governance is not intellectually driven. In the immediate past 8 years or over that we've run without fear of mentioning it, a very, 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 very nepotistic government that believes in itself and only its close friends. And we are seeing a worst case scenario with this. We are having a crop of a club of governors who believe only in themselves, that are very, very condescending, and who believe only amongst them friends can rule and run Nigeria, even excluding civil servants, which is very, very dangerous. I say it boldly that this government has come with a style where it only believes in itself, its friends, and has actually sidetracked civil servants who we suspect over the years of being incompetent. But the reality is these are the constitutional invested people to support politicians in running the state. This government is not running Nigeria through the civil service, through the civil service structure. And this is where the danger is. There is an extent to which you can have self-belief. The civil service is the constitutionally established vessel through which politics goes through a manufacturing process to deliver service to the people. And you cannot sidetrack them where you have ministers and heads of parastatals coming in with a retinue of special assistants from private sectors or just direct friends to sidetrack the civil servants. And this is why no policy actually have a sense.
Okay.
Simply one, from my military perspective, the jump up to military solution to the coup in Niger simply shows that the president didn't procure professional advice, both from the defense and the diplomatic sector, on how to go. And this is what goes even in different sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. Cameron, you have the next minute to offer your reaction, and then we can close the discussion.
Thanks, Femba. I hesitate to offer too much of a reaction, being, not being Nigerian and having, enjoyed and benefited from the last hour of hearing our panelists discuss these really complicated issues. I think just maybe the one thing that strikes me listening to the conversation, but also having been on the ground with you to write this report, and having been a long time follower of Nigeria, is how difficult this country is to define. And for foreigners like me and those in Washington or in New York or Houston or wherever we are, how really difficult it is to define this country. And we touched on some of these points in the course of this conversation, and we certainly heard it when we were on the ground. When foreigners like me come to the country, and I speak to the dozens of people that we met with across Abuja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt, everyone's trying to define to us what Nigeria is. It's an oil country. It's a gas country. It's the biggest economy on the continent. It's the biggest population. There are all of these different labels that people use almost as a shorthand to define what Nigeria is. But in those labels, there's always a gap. And we've heard that today about the gap between Nigeria actually being a gas country, or an oil country, or a stable country, or an unstable country. None of these labels neatly apply, and there's always a kind of counter narrative that we can hear people make to these labels, and we've heard it across the panel today. And so I think that we have to have a much more nuanced view and nuanced understanding of what this country is, and frankly where this country is going, because it continues to confound its own people and foreign analysts who have predicted its demise many times over, and who have also predicted its takeoff many times over. And so I think that's for those of us like me who continue to study this country, it's a source of endless fascination and enjoyment, and in trying to understand just what this country is, and how it defines itself, and what its future will look like. And so I like to think that we've maybe moved the ball just a little bit today in this conversation, but I've certainly benefited from the rich range of perspectives of all of our panelists. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Nigeria is a complex country. The situation is much more nuanced. I'd like to thank our audience that was able to join us. The report again is Nigeria's Evolving Outlook, New Politics, Old Outcomes. It's on our website, csrs.org. I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists, Brigadier General Saleh Bala, retired general from the Nigerian military, Ms. Fadekemi Abiru, Head of Insight at Steers Inc. in Lagos, Ms. Amaka Ankur, Africa Director and Head of Practice at Eurasia Group in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank our technical team, Eric and Shi, who managed this session. And equally importantly, I'd like to thank Chevron, which gave us a grant enabling this report and this event. Thank you very much. This concludes our session.